Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Make him the cutest that I've ever seen. Give him 2 lips.
After James confided in me about his experience with his great-grandmother's ghost, we didn't really talk about things like that again for a while. Even though he believed he may have experienced something, and had most likely seen other odd things in his time as a police officer, he still didn't really believe in the paranormal, although he wanted to. Almost like there was a veil in front of his eyes, which prevented him from seeing what was really happening in mineral wells. I, on the other hand, had abandoned all hope of talking myself out of believing in this stuff. I was fully invested. I had my next run-in about a year later. James was out sick. The flu, I believe, and I responded to a vagrancy call at the old Norwood Hospital. It had been abandoned for some time, and we had gotten constant reports that a man was living on the 3rd floor and making a racket at all hours of the night. Initially, the MWPD had sort of looked the other way, the reason which I was not privy to, but this time, I was told to go over there immediately and get him out of there if possible. I arrived just after 10 p.m. and parked my squad car across the street. The Norwood Hospital had been built sometime around 1904, I believe, when Dr. Norwood and his wife had moved to Mineral Wells. It was used as a private hospital, as far as I know, and Dr. Norwood apparently even had some tie to T.B. Baker, but I couldn't recall what it was. As I was walking up to the entrance, I noticed the flicker of a light in the 3rd-story window, most likely a candle, confirming that someone was up there. The front door was still boarded up, but there was a window on the left side of the front of the building that had been broken and all of the glass removed. I pulled out my flashlight and climbed in. The inside of the building had decayed with age, and all the signs you'd expect in a vagrancy were present. There were old clothes on the floor, empty food containers, beer cans, and the place was in extremely poor condition. The smell was awful too. I checked the 1st floor and found nothing. There was an open door that appeared to lead to a basement, but I decided that would not be on my agenda for the night. The 2nd floor was much like the 1st, except there was also a room that looked like it may have been a nursery or a child's playroom, littered with old stuffed toys, a rocking horse, and several rotting bunk beds. Just as you'd expect, it creeped me out royally. When I got to the stairs that led to the 3rd floor, I heard something rustling up in the darkness above me. I'm not going to lie, I was not real happy about having to go up there, but the top brass had made it clear that I needed to take care of this tonight. "It's the police," I announced to the black void. "If you're up there, I need you to come down." I sat in silence for a minute, listening. Nothing but the wind outside. I began to slowly ascend the stairs, with my flashlight as my guide, and my hand on my hip. I swung my flashlight across the room, and saw a figure, huddled in the corner under several blankets, covering his face. I began to walk towards him cautiously. I smelled the man before I really saw him, but once I did, I realized the smell was more desirable. He appeared to be in his 50s, but I had the feeling he was much younger. His fingers were gnarled, and his face bore the mask of addiction and depression. When he began to mumble, I noticed his teeth were black and crumbling. "Mariana, is that you? Take me, now." "Sir, I need you to show me your hands. What are you doing up here?" I said. This time, he spoke more loudly. "The children. They won't leave me alone. The poor children. They are missing pieces. Are you here to take me? The children are always playing. They are never quiet. They went to meet the doctor. The water didn't help. They always tell me. I never sleep. Are you here to take me?" There had obviously been no children in this building for quite some time, but maybe his encounter with them had been of a different sort. I stood the man up and searched his person, finding $2 in one pocket and a burn-up piece of tinfoil in the other. I checked his fingers, and sure enough, he had the telltale signs of a long-term methamphetamine use. Burnt fingers and all. Meth had always been a relatively serious problem in mineral wells. It's cheap, It can be made with mostly household chemicals, and once they start, they can't escape its grip, often for life. I threatened to arrest him for possession of paraphernalia, but he agreed to tell me where he had got the meth from instead. Lions Park, as the dope heads called it, a place well known for its drug activity. He didn't have any of it on him, but I did explain to him that he'd be arrested for trespassing. He seemed relieved as I escorted him down the 3rd floor stairs. Back on the 2nd floor, I noticed something I hadn't before. Scrawled in some dark substance on the wall at the bottom of the stairs. The man, Victor was his name it would turn out, noticed it too, and just started quietly sobbing to himself. We exited as quickly as possible. As I drove off towards the station, I recalled that I had seen a light in the 3rd floor window when I had first arrived. However, there hadn't been any candles, lit or otherwise, when I had gotten up there. I glanced in my rearview window at the old hospital receding in the background, expecting to see only darkness, but instead, the telltale spark of a candle flickered back, the wind in the trees carrying the faint laughter of children. Several days later, I paid my first visit to Mary Scott. Miss Scott was known in the community as being a reputable source of Mineral Wells lore, as well as for her discretion. She had taught at one of the local schools in the 70s and 80s, and had retired to her small but well-kept estate on the south side of town, outside the city limits. James had actually set us up. She had taught him in kindergarten, and then again in middle school. The Norwood incident had pushed me into full investigation mode, and I needed some answers. I believe this was as good a start as any. I arrived at her place in mid-afternoon, dressed in plain clothes, so as not to attract any attention to myself. Now that I was actively seeking information on paranormal activity in Mineral Wells, I had to be extra careful. At this point, I wasn't even entirely sure I could trust this woman, but I didn't really have any choice. Her home was a small, cozy brick house, tucked several hundred feet off the road. A narrow driveway guided me under the sprawling arms of several mature oaks. There was a small pond off to the side, with a weathered dock and several dogs panting about. I knocked on the door, and was quickly greeted by a woman, who appeared to be in her 60s, considerably shorter than me, and just beginning to gray around her temples, with kind eyes and a knowing smile. A teacher for sure, and someone who seemed to be wise beyond her years. She invited me in, and with a "Thank you, ma'am," I graciously accepted. After some small talk about James and my move to Mineral Wells, we sat down in the living room, with our iced teas, and got down to business. "What can I help you with, dear?" she asked. "Miss Scott, Mary, sorry. I'm not exactly sure how to put this, but I'm just going to come out and say it. I've experienced some things in Mineral Wells that I can't quite explain rationally," I said with hesitation. "Go on," she said knowingly. "Well, there's something odd about Mineral Wells. I've encountered spirits, or people possessed by spirits, multiple times since I started work here. The problem is, no one else sees them. Does that sound crazy?" "Tell me something," she started. "Do you drink the mineral water? The crazy water, as they call it?" "No, I don't," I said. "I have a bottle at my apartment, but it's currently unopened." "Good. Keep it that way," she said, sipping her tea. "Most of what I know comes second and third hand, from stories passed down through the generations, and the rest from countless hours studying old deeds, contracts, journal entries, and any other documents I could get my hands on. You're right, something is rotten in Mineral Wells. Mineral Hells, as I call it. And it all started with the cursed mineral water Old Man Lynch summoned from the ground all those years ago. By all accounts, he was a sociopath and a scoundrel. I don't drink it either anymore, and from what I have gathered, that's what allows people like us to actually see what's actually going on. Most of the locals have lived on it all their lives. It's made them blind to the true face of this godforsaken town. It also may make them more susceptible to suggestion, even possession, by the other side." Suddenly, Several things made sense at once. Pamela was born in Mineral Wells and lived here her entire life, and I would venture a guess that Ellie and the man at the VA had too. It also made sense now why James wasn't able to come to grips with the things he had seen. "What's wrong with the water?" I asked. "That's a good question. I believe Mr. Lynch tapped into more than he bargained for when he dug that first mineral well. It sparked a chain of events that has somehow caused the dead to remain in mineral wells long after they have passed. The water itself does have extremely high levels of lithium, but I suspect there is something more to it that causes folks to turn a blind eye to the influence the spirits have on our world. There are others, though, like us, that know the truth." "Mary, there is so much more that I want to know," I started, now getting excited. "Do you know anything about Dr. Norwood? I have a feeling he is somehow involved in all this." "Not much. Only whispers here and there. A name kept coming up. Marianne, I believe." "Mariana?" I asked, remembering the name hellishly scrawled on the hospital wall. "Yes, that's it. Mariana," she went on. "She was Dr. Norwood's head nurse for much of the time the hospital was open. I believe he was an osteopath by trade, but there were rumors that something else was going on there. What exactly, I'm not sure. Many years ago, I heard the records are said to be hidden somewhere in that building, but I couldn't begin to tell you where, or if they're there at all." She went on, but the sound of her voice faded from my consciousness, and was replaced by a singular picture. The dingy, wooden stairs leading down into the basement at the Norwood Hospital. If the records were still in the building, they were down there. Finding them was the first step in unlocking this mystery. I had to find them. I reluctantly cut our conversation short, thanking Mary, and telling her we would meet again. I promised to share any further information I found with her. I got the feeling, as I was leaving, that she had stuck her neck out by talking to me, and I was grateful for the help. As I drove back down a long driveway under those old oaken sentinels, picturing Mary alone with her tea and her dogs, I felt a feeling of sadness and weight envelop me, like being wrapped in a thick blanket on the bottom of the ocean. I drove on. That night, I parked my squad car across the street from the Norwood, as I had several days earlier. I was on the clock, and could easily explain my purpose for being here if questioned about it. And sure enough, as I stepped out of my vehicle, I could see the light again, flickering in the third-floor window like a modern-day will-o'-the-wisp. I opened the trunk and grabbed the black satchel inside. Once inside the building, I navigated through the grime and decay to the black hole in the wall that led down to the basement. Thank God for flashlights, I thought. The darkness there seemed palpable, like it was a living entity all its own. I started down the steps, 10 in all, and counted each as I went. If I were to lose my light source for any reason, or if I was running, I'd at least have a decent chance of getting back up the stairs without falling and hurting myself. I had also noted that it was 22 steps roughly from the door to the basement stairs. You can never be too careful. Once I made it down, I felt the grit of soil beneath my boots. I guess it made sense that the basement wasn't fully complete in a building as old as this. Surprisingly, it was relatively clean down there, but that was the only positive. The air was damp and musty and heavy with the weight of the building's history. As I swung my flashlight, the darkness retreated on cue, but grudgingly. Old equipment littered the floor, along with some decayed furniture and other furnishings. I didn't see any filing cabinets, though. No papers, folders, nothing. I cursed myself silently for thinking this was a good idea, but pressed on. The second room felt darker than the first, somehow. A cabinet had overturned, and there were broken vials and bottles littering the ground. I stepped around them, and was surprised when there wasn't another door in front of me. Just an old coal stove, flanked on either side by piles of old bricks and some old rafters. The stairs to the basement were in the back of the building, and I knew I hadn't made it back to the front. I doubled back and made sure there were no other rooms or passageways before heading back to the room with the stove. I shined my light around. I noticed the back wall was brick, and that there was a crack running up from behind the stove, halfway to the ceiling. Immediately, I began removing bricks from the pile in front of the wall, until I had enough room to slowly nudge the iron stove out of the way. It was just as I had thought. At some point, this basement had flooded, eroding the earth beneath the brick wall and causing the bricks to crack, since the wall had no weight to hold it. I had done construction in the past, and had seen this before. This wall had been built shoddily, and probably in a hurry. At the bottom, the bricks weren't being held together by mortar at all. A few light kicks created just what I needed to proceed. A passageway under the old brick wall, into hell, for all I knew. My heart was pounding, and I absolutely did not want to go in. I have no trouble admitting that now. I had come too far to turn back though, so I got on my hands and knees and crawled through the small opening. As I stood up and dusted myself off, my heart froze in my chest. Filing cabinets, rows of them. They were similar to the kind offices used today, except they were made of solid wood, probably oak, and very well preserved for their age. They had brass plates on the outside, with descriptions. The room appeared to be untouched after all these years. Mary had been right. I walked along the wall quickly, not wanting to waste any more time in this place than I had to, until I found the cabinet I was looking for. The one marked experimental. Experimental. The word itself seemed evil, somehow. I slowly opened it, and over the creak of wood sliding on wood, I thought I heard the faint laughter of children. A cold sweat broke out over the skin of my arms, and I got the feeling that I was being watched. I grabbed as many files as I could fit in my satchel, closed the drawer, and turned to leave. That's when I saw them. In the middle of the room, standing perfectly still, was a group of children. I was paralyzed, not by any external force, but by the grip of unadulterated fear. They looked back at me, eyes blinking almost in unison, with gleeful smiles. Then, it was as if a record skipped, and the children standing there changed. I recoiled in horror as I realized what I was seeing. The girl standing in front had two blank, scarred holes for her eyes. The younger boy next to her waved, his hand bearing only 2 fingers and a thumb. Another boy was on the floor, pulling himself forward with the stumps of his 2 missing legs dragging behind. There were others in the same condition. The record skipped again, and they were whole, all standing still again, grinning from ear to ear. I found my body could move again, so I turned and ran as fast as any human has ever ran before, crawling under the wall before sprinting the rest of the way out of that godforsaken building, back through the basement, 10 steps up, 22 steps out. As I ran, I heard the children singing behind me. As it got louder, I realized it wasn't a song, but a nursery rhyme. One that still haunts me to this very day.
1 for the tongue, and 2 for the nose. 1 for the tongue, and 2 for the nose. 3 for eyes, and 4 for toes. Ring the bell, the time is near. Ding dong, Mariana's here. Ding dong, Mariana's here.
Back at my apartment, I sat alone underneath a single light illuminating my small dining table, head in my hands. I could still see the young girl's hollow eyes, staring blankly back at me. I shuddered, reached into the satchel on the table, and slowly pulled out the 5 folders I had retrieved from the filing cabinet at the Norwood. They were legal-sized, olive in color, and only slightly faded. They look no different from any other folder you might come across at your office. What they signified, however, was something much more sinister and damning. I reached for one, but couldn't bring myself to open it. I stared at them for a while, before putting them back in the satchel and closing the flap. I was exhausted and terrified, and I had had enough, at least for the night. In the morning, I still couldn't bring myself to look at them. Something had happened to me the night before, the nature of which is hard to explain, but I'll try. I felt dull, not as in uninteresting, but as if the bright and polished parts of me had been scratched off or rubbed away, leaving only raw and faded parts behind. Is that what depression feels like? I think it's easy to pretend that you know how you would react if you ever came face to face with a true ghost or spirit. I think what we see in movies and on television desensitizes us to how it would really feel if we experienced it ourselves. That type of terror is not something the mind can manage on its own. I'll tell you that. The body takes over. Instinct, perhaps. Something primal, woven into our DNA. It leaves you changed. Left me changed, anyway. It was probably almost a week before I mustered the courage to find out what was inside those folders. The first file appeared to be the file of a 7-year-old boy from South Carolina, admitted for the treatment of his leukemia, referred to only as Charlie. I flipped through the pages until I found one with a surgical notes heading, entitled, Replantation of Severed Limb of Minor Child. It went on to describe in detail a surgical procedure with the purpose of reattaching the subject's severed hand. The words were technical in nature, and I didn't understand some of them. Quote, Preparation of the stump included the shortening of both bones, radius/ulna, by 1 centimeter. Repair of the radial artery, ulnar nerve, and median nerve was attempted along with 2 veins, one of the volar aspect and one on the dorsum. I skipped over to the next page and found at the bottom, under surgical outcome, quote, Failure to reattach hand. Beside it, in a woman's flowing script, something was scribbled. Quote, Mother sent to MS. I shuddered at the thought of a 7-year-old losing a hand. But how had Charlie been admitted for leukemia and ended up having his hand severed? Also, who was MS? Possibly Mariana? I flipped back 2 pages and found what I was looking for. Quote, Preparation notes. Clinician's third attempt at attaching a child's severed appendage. Subject Charlie was mildly sedated with heroin, hydrochloride, and given a local anesthetic at the right wrist, fully conscious. M assisted with a cleaver, severing the hand cleanly. Mother watched from the observation room. I sat in shock as the realization crept in. I didn't want to believe it. I quickly scanned through the other files, but found similar accounts of gruesome reattachment surgeries, which confirmed what I already suspected. Mariana was cutting up children, and then Dr. Norwood was attempting to put them back together again. The girl with the missing eyes, the nursery rhyme, the room upstairs, even what Victor had said, it all made perfect sense now. Dr. Norwood seemed to be practicing his surgery skills on unsuspecting children who had been admitted for unrelated diseases or ailments. What I didn't understand was how he was getting away with it. Surely the parents didn't stand by and watch their children get cut into pieces by his psychotic nurse. There was more to this, I knew, and I wouldn't find it in these files. I shoved them away in disgust. Afterwards, the depression set in deeper and more fully. I still had a job to do, however, and that was to protect the citizens of Mineral Wells, Texas. I tried to go about my usual work, handling traffic accidents and other small crimes, the typical happenings of a small Texas town. At one point, I was hoping that I would forget what had happened and could return to just being a police officer. Maybe then I would feel normal again, whole again. But As you obviously know by now, Mineral Wells had other plans for me. I had heard one day about a young child from a prominent family in town who had suffered an accident while trying to operate a riding lawnmower, obviously without his parents' permission. The blade had mangled his left arm all the way up to the elbow, and it ended up having to be amputated. It was reported as a terrible tragedy. I must have been the only one that noticed, based on my close review of the picture the local newspaper ran of the model of mower the child had been injured by, that the child's leg couldn't even have reached the pedal. There was also the curious case of Brad Delaney, city council president, a member of the First United Methodist Church, who one night took the .45 he had hidden under the mattress and killed his wife in cold blood while she slept. One shot, right to the temple. Brad confessed, saying it must have been him that shot her, seeing as how it was his gun and no one else had been in the house, but he didn't remember doing it. They had found him that morning, still asleep next to his murdered wife, the mattress stained in crimson red. One evening, I responded to a report of an awful smell coming from a student's room at Weatherford College's Mineral Wells branch. The student had not been seen in several days, and based on the smell coming from the room, the administration did not want to enter the room themselves, fearing at best a dead body, and at worst, foul play. The college was located on an old site of Fort Walters, which had been a military installation during World War II. I had run across Fort Walters in the historical archives and knew a little about it. At one point during the war, it had been the largest infantry replacement training center in the United States, and several famous World War II soldiers had been trained there. I ran across several accounts of a soldier, apparently afraid of being sent off to war, who committed suicide in the barracks, and can still be heard pacing the halls on the anniversary of his death. When I arrived, security led me to the student's room. As reported, the smell was foul, and appeared to be that of a decomposing body. The security guard unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open. And that's when I saw him. In the middle of the room, hanging from a fan by a bedsheet, was the student. His face was bruised and swollen, and his eyes were bulging from his head, wide and red. A female student had passed by the room and screamed out, causing the security guard to frantically remove her from the vicinity, leaving me alone with the corpse. I looked around the room to find any signs of a struggle, but nothing else was amiss. That's when I called the investigative unit to take over. I found out several days later about something odd one of the investigative officers had found and couldn't explain. The entire room had been clean, with no books, papers, or clothes out of place, except for a single, folded piece of paper found under the desk. The officers had thought it would be a suicide note, but the words written inside didn't make any sense to them. They did to me, though. I cannot go to war. I'm sorry, Mother. Camp Walters. Several weeks later, while at a coffee shop that I frequent, only bottled water, no coffee for me, I noticed a man several tables over, staring at me. When I looked his way, he sort of flinched and acted like he had been looking somewhere else. I made a mental note of his appearance. 60-ish years old, dark-haired, and wearing some kind of uniform. He was holding a cup of coffee, and I could see that his hands were dirty and gnarled from manual labor. Not exactly the type of person who typically frequents a coffee shop. When I got up to leave, I could feel him watching me. Over the next several weeks, I saw the same man there 3 more times, always far enough away to maintain his cover, but close enough to see what I was doing. I was pretty sure that he was following me by that point, but I honestly had no clue as to why. He seemed harmless enough, so I wasn't frightened, just curious. I got the feeling he was sizing me up, if that makes any sense. One day, I woke to a note tucked into the side of my door. I opened it and read the hastily scribbled words, written on the back of a receipt from a local garage. Coffee shop, 3 p.m. I'll admit, I was a little nervous that this person knew where I lived, although it shouldn't have been hard to follow me here. The coffee shop was a safe public place, so I didn't see any reason why I shouldn't go. I had never pictured myself as the type of person that would respond dutifully to the instructions written in shady notes stuffed into my doorframe. But the times, they were changing, and depression or not, it was time to get back to my investigation. I arrived at 3 to find my new friend seated in his usual spot. He saw me come in. A moment later, he was out of his seat and walking down the hallway at the back of the shop. I followed him. Exiting out of the back door, the employees used for taking out the trash. He was standing there, lighting a cigarette, looking generally nervous and disheveled. "You want to tell me why you've been following me, Stan?" I started, probably sounding a bit more stern than I actually felt. I found that people tended to follow instructions better if you spoke to them by name, and the patch on his uniform had provided me that information. I just had to be sure. "Mary told me you two had talked, but I wanted to make sure you were okay for myself," he replied nervously. Mary Scott, I thought. He must be one of the others she had been talking about. Those that knew the truth about mineral wells. "And what did you find out about following me into a coffee shop?" I asked. "Well, for starters, all you drink is regular bottled water. No coffee or tap water. Also, I didn't find any of the crazy water bottles outside in the trash at your apartment." A. Creepy. B. Touché, I thought. This guy was smarter than he looked. "So, what am I doing here?" I said. He threw down his cigarette. "Mary said you knew what was going on in mineral wells. Said you may be trying to do something about it." I wasn't sure I trusted him at this point, and he could see it on my face. "Oh, don't worry. I don't drink it either. I've never touched the stuff." My father made sure I understood that. "Who was your father?" "He was an orderly at the old milling sanatorium." "That damned place." "I know of it," I said coldly. "I thought you should know what he told me about that place." He paused for a minute, then went on. "He said it was the scariest place he had ever stepped foot in. He helped with patients, administered medicine, and cleaned the rooms, so he was familiar with the going-ons. He told me about the different types of treatments they would perform on the patients there. Electroshock therapy, experimental surgeries, psychological experiments, sleep deprivation studies, even waterboarding. The screams were the worst part, he said. I know, they aren't exactly the type of bedtime stories you should tell your children, but I don't think he could help himself. He couldn't sleep for most of his adult life, and my mother died when I was young. The place was hellish, he said, but they always had an influx of new patients, regardless of how bad it was. Did he say anything about where all the patients came from? He pieced it together. When news got out about the mineral water, people came from far and wide to be treated. Bathhouses and spas were some of the main attractions for those with less serious ailments of the body. But Millings promised a cure for every dementia and psychological issue under the sun. So the people poured in. Most never left. Business was good. Oh, to be a worm in the peach tree. Worm in the peach tree? I repeated. I hadn't heard that turn of phrase before. Oh, it's just something my dad used to say. It basically means someone is taking advantage of a situation. There were also backroom deals some of the other businesses in town, he went on. I think the Baker management would refer people to Millings, as most of the out-of-towners ended up there first. I also know that Dr. Norwood would sometimes send patients their way. My dad was always the most curious about those patients, he said, because they always seemed to be pretty healthy people, at least when they first got there. They always screamed the loudest. It suddenly got cold and dark where we were standing. I looked up to see the thunderheads rolling in. We'd have some weather tonight. I changed the subject. How do you know Mary? And what is her part in all of this? He looked like he was about to respond, then thought better of it. You'll have to ask her about that one. The bitter, biting rain that began to fall cut off any further conversation between us. Early the next day, after my shift the previous night, I pulled out the files again. I had a hunch about something Stan had said. Plus, the middle of a thunderstorm is always the perfect time to read about sadistic shit. I found Charlie's file and flipped to the page I was looking for. I found the hastily scribbled words again. Quote, "Mother sent to MS." It wasn't a person. It was a place. Milling Sanatorium. Dr. Norwood had been sending the perfectly healthy parents of the children he was experimenting on to be experimented on themselves. I looked back through the children's files, and my other hunch was confirmed. All the children were from out of town. South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, Rhode Island, and Tennessee. I finally got it. Imagine this. It's the early 1900s. There's no television, social media, or cell phones. People keep in touch through letters, for Christ's sake. Your child is terminally ill with cancer, or some other illness. Or perhaps it's you that's sick, and you've lost all hope, until you hear about Mineral Wells, Texas, home of the crazy water that heals all that ails you. You'll try anything. You pack up your bags and make the long journey to Texas. Once you're there, you'll try anything, and you're never heard from again. For it to work, the families would need to be from anywhere but Texas. Check. You need a network of conspirators to make sure all loose ends were tied up. Check. Dr. Norwood got the children, and Millings got the parents, or anyone else from the baker who was dealing with a psychological infirmity. If anyone ever tracked you down at Millings, which would be nearly impossible, who would ever believe your crazy stories? By that time, you'd be so drugged, emotionally scarred, or both, no one would dream of interrupting your treatment. Could law enforcement have been involved as well? The scope of it blew my mind. Think of all the suffering and death. Think of those poor children. All because of some foul-smelling water, the hope-filled human spirit, and a group of doctors more sadistic than any you could ever imagine. Worms in the peach tree.